You look at the history of St. Louis around 1905 through 1930. It was a time when a lot of those organizations, civic organizations, were fighting. But it wasn't just in St. Louis, it was all over the country. It's what I call 100 years of emancipation without freedom. You know, emancipated 1865, and people had to fight all the way to 1965 before all those, basic freedoms and given the same kind of rights and benefits that everybody else has.
We're in the Jim Crow era in Missouri, which, certainly is a border state, right? So, we aren't in the deep South, but certainly we're sort of still thinking about, Black folks were not treated equitably here, right? Like it was sort of the vision was to get across the river to Illinois, and that was sort of the true north.
St. Louis was certainly one of the most segregated cities in the United States after the Civil War because of the Black migration from the South that took place, and a lot of the Blacks moved north along the Mississippi River, and St. Louis was one of the stopping off points. One of the important things was that St. Louis was so segregated because the Blacks were in one area of St. Louis, the Italians in the other, and Germans in the other.
Well, the Ville was on the outskirts of St. Louis. It originally was not part of the city, and it belonged to a white florist. And he had a racetrack, and he had an inn where people would stop off. Ellardsville at first, that's the original name, and it was short over time to the Ville.
So the Ville was actually it was a stable community. It was a very stable, very well-known African-American community. And it was the site of the first African-American high school west of the Mississippi, Sumner.
We had Poro College, which was one of the first schools for the training of African-American women in the beauty culture business. Chuck Berry also was a student at that school, I understand.
Annie Malone Home, she was one of the first Black female entrepreneurs in the United States, created a foster care home for Black children.
We had Turner School for Handicapped Youngsters, built in 1925, the first school of its kind for African-American youngsters in the United States. I think one important thing to remember is that many of the people who worked in the Ville lived in the Ville. And so you had a climate where you had the workers plus the professionals all intermingling, attending church together, seeing each other on a daily basis, which made it a special place to live.
Nowadays, they always talk about a walkable community. The Ville was the original walkable community. We had everything we needed in our community. So we're talking about a segregated neighborhood, but the key was that we had a diverse population of people in there from different income levels. We could walk anywhere to the store. We had grocery stores. We had fresh fruit and vegetable stands. We even had a movie theater in the Poro.
The neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods. There was the Black doctor, the Black lawyer, the Black administrators. Folks lived in the same neighborhood. So it gave us an opportunity to see professionals, to see tradesmen, to see business owners actually interact in their own neighborhood. We had these role models that were there. Certainly it was segregated, certainly it's Missouri, certainly it's just north of the Mason-Dixon line, but at the end of the day, we had an opportunity to just be kids growing up in a community that looked like us.
That's almost non-existent today, because what we've gone is we've gone to the malls. So when you go to the malls, people are coming from neighborhoods they don't live in and getting service. Whereas when I was a kid, didn't have unemployment. Why? Because all of the stores and things that was in your community had to hire people who lived in the community to service these people.
The Ville being less than a square mile, it made it a community where people felt connected. Money stayed in the community a number of times before it disappeared. I think that's important to remember because you build wealth in a community by wealth staying in the community. And I think another thing it's good to remember it thrived because others couldn't. And let me explain that. Many of the teachers and professionals were forced by segregation to work in the community. So many of the people who lived here got the best because they couldn't get the best. Another thing that happened during that time, teachers were not allowed to get married. So many of the students became their family.
Doctors, they couldn't get married during that time. And my Uncle Red, who became medical director later on, married my Aunt Dorothy, who was a school teacher, but they had to keep it hidden during the time they were married for the first 4 years. It was just thought that doctors couldn't perform their duties if they were married early, or school teachers were thought that they couldn't perform as a school teacher if they had a husband. I don't know why the social structure was like that, but that's the way it was.
Teachers, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, prominent businessmen, all lived in the Ville. It was a thriving community with people making money, and most of the stores and all the business places were owned by black people. This was great to live in the Ville. We even had a movie there, Poirot Hotel, Annie Malone, so Annie started the Poirot Hotel. And when you wanted to be an attorney, the only place that you could go was Lincoln University, and Lincoln did not have a law school. So they started the law school in the Poirot Hotel, and black attorneys taught young men to be attorneys. So this all happened at the Poirot Hotel in the Ville.
I went to Sumner High School, and across the street from my high school was the Teachers College. Around the corner was the branch of Lincoln University's law school. So we saw students who were becoming lawyers. So what I saw as a high school student is I saw the extension of education that let me know that where I was going to high school 4 years later was not the end of my educational system, but it was the springboard, because I saw other people going to college, working on their PhD. They looked good to me. They looked like champions of the community.
Attorney Homer G. Phillips is sort of an enigmatic historical figure. Many people know certain elements of his life, but there's a lot more that hasn't been discovered about Attorney Homer G. Phillips. He was born John Wesley Phillips. I do have evidence. There's a small annotation in a newspaper from Sedalia around 1899 that announces that a John Wesley Phillips has changed his name to Homer G. Phillips, Homer Garland Phillips. I think that sort of name change preceded his matriculation to Howard University Law School. Many people don't know that Attorney Homer G. Phillips was a staunch advocate for civil rights, black civil rights. He was a staunch advocate for black voting. He was a staunch Republican activist. He helped get President Herbert Hoover elected in the Midwest region. But he was also a staunch advocate for equal rights, and particularly working against sort of rising segregation policies in the city. So Homer G. really fought against the implementation of deed restrictive covenants, for instance. Homer G. actually was instrumental in securing over $200,000 in relief for those black families who were affected in the East St. Louis race riot in 1917. And that itself really sort of catapulted him to not only local recognition, but also national recognition.
Very, very popular man in St. Louis. They wanted him even to run for mayor of the city of St. Louis during those times. And I think that if he had ran, he was so popular, he probably would have won, becoming the first African-American mayor in the city of St. Louis in the 1930s.
Homer G. Phillips was one of the many African Americans whose parents came out of the Civil War, got a taste of freedom in times of the Reconstruction, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and called for equal treatment of all citizens. The opportunity to build a black family, became a lot more realistic with the end of slavery, because one of the major aspects of slavery is that it made a precise attack on that basic unit of social organization, the black family. When you sell the child this way, the mother that way, and the father that way, you create an incredible crisis for those families from which we have never fully, recovered. So you have to see Homer G. Phillips as one of the products that came out of that Reconstruction era.
He was an attorney, a very prominent attorney, who had a strong sense of social justice. And he had lent his name and his expertise to a number of projects in the neighborhood, of uplifting the community. He had a particular interest in health, and I'm not so sure why, but this was a subject that just really caught his attention.
Not only was Homer G. a lawyer, he was also involved in distributing low-interest loans to African-American community members. And he was also a part of the newspaper business. So he was a part of the newspaper business in Sedalia, Missouri, his hometown. But he also was a partner in newspapers here in St. Louis, so particularly the St. Louis Argus, which was one of the first African-American newspapers in St. Louis. But then he began to sort of switch and begin to work with Judge Nathan Young later on in his life when he realized that there's a sort of massive transition happening among black voters, namely that black voters are switching from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, right? And so the St. Louis Argus and the St. Louis American and Homer G's interaction with both of those actually mirrors that sort of transition.
The newspaper business was extremely relevant in the African American community earlier, particularly when you had this great migration from the South. I was always interested in public policy because I thought that had an impact on people's lives, and I thought that having a black newspaper would enable me to have some impact. Our National Trade Association has called us the #1 black newspaper in the country the last 6 years. We're the largest weekly newspaper of any kind in the state of Missouri. So I'm very proud of what's happened with an institution that was started in 1928. Homer Phillips, a lawyer and activist who we admire a great deal here, was a part of the original ownership of the St. Louis American. And I would say Homer Phillips, the person who was held in high esteem by his community, we tried to use that as sort of an example, a model for how we should conduct ourselves as a newspaper.
He was also very active in getting African Americans elected to public office. He supported a bond issue, $8 million bond issue, with the understanding that $1 million would go for construction of a hospital for African Americans that would be run by African Americans and operated by them. He wanted to be a community control hospital, and he wanted to be in the African American community.
City Beautiful Bond by Mayor Henry Keel was a massive infrastructure plan. Over $80 million to improve city infrastructure, to provide new buildings for the city. And that's the time when you have black doctors who are beginning to say they needed a place to train. They needed a place where they could sharpen their medical skills, where they could get access to patients, and where they could really sort of become higher echelon physicians, meaning specialized physicians, which requires extra years of training. Originally, Homer G. Phillips was actually opposed to a segregated hospital. He did not advocate for any type of segregation. That included segregation in hospitals, which sort of goes against kind of the popular understanding of Homer G., right? That he led the movement to get Homer G. Phillips Hospital started. That eventually happened, but initially Homer G. actually would have preferred that the two city hospitals in St. Louis actually be integrated. But when the city sort of said, we're going to stick with segregation, again, segregation policies are being implemented at this exact same time that were not there before, right? This is due in part to sort of black migration from the rural South. Many people are coming through St. Louis, stopping there, right? So the black population is expanding rapidly. And the old city hospital for African Americans, City Hospital number 2, was not enough.
And this was People's Hospital that was totally inadequate. And also they put blacks in the City Hospital number 1 in the basement behind the steam pipes. So because of the poor care that blacks were getting, because St. Louis had a large influx of blacks from the South after slavery, Homer G. Phillips thought that this would be the best thing to do, to have a hospital totally built for the black community.
And so Homer G. was instrumental in getting a key provision in the 1923 bond issue for a Negro hospital. There was debate about whether that Negro hospital should be separate from City Hospital Number 1, if it should be close to City Hospital Number 1.
There were those who said, let's put it as an attachment, an annex to the White Hospital under white administration. He said no.
And so Homer G. said instead, and many agreed, that if they weren't going to have a hospital where they could practice autonomously, doctors and nurses could practice autonomously, where black patients could have dignity, not to suffer the sort of indignities of white physicians, then they needed a completely separate hospital.
He went to the Board of Aldermen, where it was finally decided that it would be a separate hospital, because they wanted to renege on that at first.
And that debate took 10 years, right? So from the 1923 bond issue to 1933, ground is initially being broken on the Homer G. Phillips Hospital.
And all through that time, Jim Crow was raging. St. Louis City was extremely segregated. I'm talking about most black folks were concentrated east on the other side of Jefferson Avenue. Then it was Grand. Then it was Kingside before they started expanding west. But the important point is that shortly after the bond issue was passed, Homer G. Phillips was assassinated right there on Delma and Euclid.
It's unfortunate that he didn't really live to see his dream come to fruition because under mysterious circumstances, he was shot by two gentlemen on his way to his office on a streetcar, a murder which was never solved, by the way.
Debates, vary again according to why Homer G. was murdered. It seemed initially that the two individuals who were seen, witnessed, shooting Homer G. Phillips shot him because of debates about an estate check that Homer G. would not disperse to his client. There was a dispute about whether, the daughter of a man or his sort of younger wife would get the estate. And it was a sizable estate. I believe it was around $3,000. Homer G. successfully secured the money for the daughter of this man, but he charged $1,000 for his fee. They did not pay that fee. And so it was assumed that Homer G. was murdered because he did not disperse the whole of that check. Two individuals were caught, they were apprehended, they were identified in lineups, they were even brought to trial, but neither were convicted of the crime. It's strange to me, at least, and it's strange to other people, that two young African-American men who were witnessed publicly shooting this man were not convicted of the crime. That's interesting to me.
Of course, the killer was never apprehended. And of course, if you don't look for people, you don't find them. And I'm sure in those days and the circumstances behind it, there was not a lot of looking because it would have taken effort to find. And that was not high on the priority scale, as we would say now, to find out who killed him.
I don't know either way. I don't think there is going to be a definitive answer as to why Homer G. was assassinated, murdered, however you want to sort of describe that. But it is curious to me that these two young men who had arrest records before this, right, were not convicted of the crime. Were they paid? No one knows. I mean, was this a hit? No one knows. Was this really about the estate check? No one knows. Because that case was not closed, that really sort of paved the way to the institution itself being named after Homer G. Phillips.
It is the number one most prominent unsolved murder in the history of the city of St. Louis. He paid a price for this facility, paid with his life. He's the kind of murder that you have to put on the same level as a Martin Luther King, a Malcolm X, a Homer G. Phillips, even though we don't speak that much enough about him. You will not find any monument anywhere outside of this facility to the memory or to the incredible contribution of attorney Homer G. Phillips.
calls were immediately made to name the hospital after Homer G. So right after his death, right? I mean, and it seemed relevant to put his name on this hospital. But you do have individuals like David Grant who would later say, naming Homer G. Phillips Hospital is actually sort of a double-edged sword, right? On the one end, it is certainly an institution of pride. It's a vision of progress, particularly in this neighborhood. On the other hand, it still is a segregated institution, right? So even though the history of segregation has produced this sort of jewel in history, as it were, it's still a segregated institution. And Homer G. fought every type of segregation tooth and nail, right? And I wonder, were Homer G. alive today, what would he really think about his name being on this institution?
That was supposed to be Colored Hospital number 2. And of course, it was always number 2. I came from that era, and I understand the 1, 2, A, B. So I do not call those hospitals, I call them by their name. I called City Hospital, not City Hospital number 1, but it was either City Hospital or it was Max Starkloff. And Homer Phillips Hospital was Homer G. Phillips Hospital, not City Hospital number 2.
Both sort of sentiments are there. They exist simultaneously. It is important that we sort of remember this Black lawyer at this Black institution, but at the same time, the circumstances that produce this institution themselves are, deplorable.
When Homer G. Phillips opened up, it was a great day of celebration. Thousands filled the streets. All dignitaries came. The newspapers posted it as one of the best African-American hospitals in the community, St. Louis, and the world.
Again, you have to remember the time also. So this is 1937, and this is a time when Roosevelt himself is very anxious about the war effort and really reaching out to the African-American community. Frankly, it may not have been the president as much as it was Eleanor Roosevelt, who really was the driving force for social change. And so she perhaps was the one who moved Harold Ickes, who was Secretary of the Interior, to support the Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And in fact, he was here during the program, during the opening of the hospital, the opening ceremony. So it really was a national event.
The mayor of St. Louis was there, Bernard Dickman. But what's interesting about him is that he actually, sort of before he became mayor, was involved in the St. Louis Real Estate Exchange, which was heavily involved in sort of restricting housing in St. Louis and steering, Black and white individuals to different parts of town, right? So even though the mayor sort of celebrated this hospital and sort of also celebrated too that he was able to build this hospital, right? As opposed to his Republican predecessor, Victor Miller, the hospital project languished for a decade under his administration. So in many ways, even though Dickman had this sort of strained history, right? I mean, to sort of secure the Black vote, which is really important in St. Louis. I mean, he really sort of put his efforts to building this hospital. You also had the governor, you had state representatives. And again, this also sort of embodies a sort of a New Deal moment, right? You had these sort of, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration were deeply involved in helping to fund and construct this hospital. So the infusion of that money allowed it to really become one of the biggest Black hospitals in the nation, to be quite frank.
Well, Homer G. Phillips is very close to me because my father was in the first group of interns that trained at Homer G. Phillips. The story goes that in 1937, when the hospital was built, my father graduated from Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and he and 27 of his fellow classmates were on their way to Kansas City to intern at Kansas City General. They had to change trains in St. Louis, and while they were in the train station, a red cap, which was the colored porters that put bags on the train, asked them where they were going. They said, well, we're going to Kansas City. He said, well, they just built a colored hospital here and they don't have any doctors. So they went out in a taxi and checked out the hospital, and they all decided to stay since they weren't paying but $10 a month, clothes and room and board, and that was the same thing that was going on in Kansas City. So they became the first 27 interns at Homer G. Phillips.
This was large. This Homer G. Phillips wasn't just a hospital. It was going to be one of the greatest African-American hospitals in the country. We had Hubbard Hospital, and we had Howard Hospital, and there were smaller hospitals, but nothing of this stature had ever been conceptualized or built for an African American community. And so this was a huge undertaking. I think that just really was illustration of Homer G. Phillips, the attorney, of his broader vision, that he was going to create this momentous, remarkable hospital, which was going to be the training program for at least a third of all African American physicians between 1937 and 1979. Just a remarkable feat in itself.
Then we had a nurses program, nursing school, and there's a tunnel that goes from the nursing school all the way to the hospital where you didn't have to go outside.
And because the facility was so special, they built the main hospital, a nursing home, and a power plant, and also interns' quarters. The nursing home was built for 148 nurses, and the interns' quarters housed, I think it was 28 interns. The hospital was built to take care of 635 beds, which was really something. It was one of the largest hospitals in the country at the time.
Again, although the Ville was there beforehand, Homer G. Phillips really put his stamp, his imprimatur on the Ville, and the two really were just indistinguishable. Homer G. was the Ville, and the Ville was Homer G.
So by the time of the hospital's dedication, the hospital was named Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And the dedication ceremony, sort of one of the last items on the program, was that city officials handed the keys of the hospital to the hospital's medical director, Henry Hampton, who was the first African-American medical director of the hospital.
This is at the time, of course, now when during rigid segregation in a lot of large parts of the country, and this fallacy that African-Americans could not run a hospital. African-American doctors could not deliver care of the quality of white physicians. African-American nurses could not deliver care the way white nurses could. And so Henry Hampton had this knowledge, and he had every desire to break that stereotype, to produce a hospital which was going to be of the highest quality, having the highest volume, and really creating innovation which will be adopted by white hospitals. In the first year, from 1937 to 1938, they had over 100,000 patients visit. Now, the Ville neighborhood is relatively small, as you can imagine. So you can see this is drawing patients from a large catchment area. And Henry Hampton said, when they walk through this door, America's eyes are on us. We're going to show that we can do this and do this extraordinarily well. And this is what Henry Hampton wanted. This was his legacy. He wanted people to remember this as a phenomenally great hospital, not a phenomenally great black hospital, but a great hospital, period.
Then Dr. William Sinkler took over, who was a sort of prolific figure in the history of the hospital, and really not only had a hand in sort of making sure that the hospital itself ran smoothly, but also really helped to develop the internship and residency programs.
And it was through the program that he set up that the knowledge came from Sinkler and his know-how and what have you to all of the modalities of general surgery. And I was privileged to have scrubbed with him on several occasions. In doing so, you watch his technique, how he approached the problem, what he did with the problem, and the outcome that he had. And all of it was very, very admirable.
You know, he was a surgeon, and I was a pediatrician. And we were on the 5th floor, and they on the 2nd or 3rd floor, I think. And of course, he had his office. And usually you didn't see him unless you were getting called on the carpet. And fortunately, I never had to.
Well, Dr. William A. Sinkler was a classmate of my father at Howard University, so they knew each other well. He was small in stature. He was about 5'6", and they called him Little Willie because he was so short. And he had to step up on a stool when he operated, but Dr. Sinkler was a whiz at surgery. So because of the poor care that they had down south, one of the pharmacist down there, Dr. Pierce, asked Dr. Sinkler would he come down and operate on some poorly taken care of patients in Monroe. So because it was a Catholic hospital and because it was segregated, they wouldn't take or operate on any patients in Monroe that were black. So Dr. Sinkler and Dr. Vaughn went down to Monroe, Louisiana to operate on these patients that had been selected for them. So when they get to Monroe, they had to change their clothes in the janitor's closet. So when they went in the operating room, since they had several patients, some of the patients needed more than one operation to be done. One particular lady needed a hysterectomy and a gallbladder taken out, which is unusual to do at the same time. So you expect the operation to take a long time. The white doctors in the community had gathered around the table to watch these doctors operate. And because they had to be operating pretty quickly, they were just whizzing along. And one of the white doctors just couldn't contain himself and say, "Ooh, wee, look at these little niggas go." And so that was a story that just went around the hospital, and everybody just laughed about how fast Dr. Sinkler was.